Nick, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Pranay. It was a little bit of a back and forth to get this show scheduled and and done, so I appreciate your patience.
Well, good things come to those who wait. And I'm really excited about this conversation. I think listeners will find it really edifying. And it's something that, given the subject matter being about the occupation of Minneapolis, and given that we are both based in Minneapolis, this is more so, I think, than a lot of the topics that I cover in the show as something that I feel like obviously a very strong personal connection to and investment in. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get to talk about it, I guess, on this show and hopefully share some analysis with folks from both of our perspectives here on the ground in Minneapolis. And, especially now looking back, it's been several months since the formal end of Operation Metro Surge. Of course, anyone who's in Minneapolis will tell you that ICE is still very much here. I still get messages in the Signal chats about ICE sightings or ICE abductions happening, but it's slowed down quite a lot. And I think this is a good sort of opportunity to do a bit of a retrospective. And I'm very grateful to have you back on the show, of course, as a returning guest. If listeners who are newer to the show aren't aware, last summer you and I recorded an episode on your book, Our History is the Future, and then sort of the history of indigenous resistance in the United States and in North America more broadly. And I will link that in the show notes. I really encourage listeners to give that a listen if you haven't already. And yeah, really grateful to have you returning on the show. To get this conversation started, there's so much to talk about with Operation Metro Surge, and we want to connect the occupation of Minneapolis to not only the history of settler colonialism here in the U.S. and in North America, but also connecting it to U.S. imperialism abroad, particularly during this moment of escalating imperial aggression. But before we get into that sort of more theoretical or intellectual analysis, I'm wondering if you're comfortable, if you would be willing to share a little bit about personally what your experience of the federal occupation of Minneapolis was like, especially now that we are, as I said, some months out from the official end of Metro Surge. I'm curious what your biggest reflections or takeaways are, sort of looking back on everything that the city and the state went through over the winter. And what are the main things that you would want listeners who aren't based in Minneapolis, or maybe who even are based abroad and aren't in the US at all, to know about what happened here over the winter?
This is something I struggle to articulate in writing, and I've tried to write about it. I'm actually working on a piece, or have written a piece that is I'm currently drafting and sort of fleshing out. It's called The Colonialism of Our Time, and thinking about Metro Surge within the long sort of history of settler colonialism, but also in the context of what we might call fascism, authoritarianism, or that word's getting thrown around a lot, or even imperialism, because I think there's a tendency, especially here on the ground, by liberal folks and people in the Democratic Party or within the state of Minnesota, to really confine it to a regional context. And that's just not really my experience. I think there's a Minnesota exceptionalism that sort of takes center stage in a lot of these conversations, especially around the creation of this idea of an immigrant neighbor, right? Or the status of refugees. They're the sort of liberal kind of stratification of society here works in tandem with sort of how charities and nonprofits create these subjects like immigrants who are in need of help. And by help, I mean white sort of liberals coming in and stepping in and helping. So this kind of creates this idea that, there's a Minnesota nice, right? My experience, not even just Operation Metro Surge, but my experience in Minnesota has been, like on a personal note, has been pretty rocky, to say the least. I was born and raised in a place called South Dakota, where we often get pitted against states like Minnesota as being more right-wing, conservative, reactionary, racist, or outwardly racist, which is true in many regards. The state of South Dakota, at least the political machinery, produced somebody like Kristi Noem, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security during Operation Metro Surge. But I would say that in Minnesota itself, I bring this up as a point of comparison and contrast. We defeated the Keystone XL pipeline in South Dakota under a right-wing government. The tribes had united in antagonism to the state, and we defeated this international pipeline, this tar sands pipeline. That pipeline was actually rerouted through northern Minnesota, where under the leadership of Governor Walz, you had the Line 3 pipeline, which is a reroute of the tar sands coming from Alberta and then going down to the Gulf of Mexico for refinery, or to the oil refineries in Texas. They couldn't accomplish politically in red states like South Dakota, what they accomplish politically in a blue state like Minnesota that prides itself on its 10,000 lakes, its crystal clear water, its blue skies, its clean air, its boundary waters canoe area, which we could talk about, which is now being threatened with mining. So there's this idea of a Minnesota nice. And I think one of the effects of line three that folks don't really want to talk about or haven't really made the connections is that line three actually began to militarize the Department of Natural Resources, because not only were sheriff's deputies policing the line three pipeline, and the state created an escrow account that Enbridge, the pipeline company, could actually throw money into to pay these police overtime. So now, where in Standing Rock you had private security firms like Tiger Swan policing and surveilling at the expense of the pipeline company itself, now you don't have the Pinkertons anymore. You just have them just paying the sheriff's deputy, and they're also paying the DNR officers, the conservation officers who are working the pipeline protests. DNR actually begins training in tactical anti-protest, methods and things like that. And people may not see these as connecting, but the DNR was actually deployed here, actually where you and I work at the University of Minnesota campus, just off-site. There were 2 hotels that we know of, probably more, who were housing federal agents sent here during Operation Metro Surge. And to crush the protests, which were largely student-led, the DNR was deployed in riot gear against students, right, to protect ICE agents and to protect businesses that fraternized with ICE agents. So I like to begin that conversation that's where we're at. I don't actually see this as a unique phenomenon. And I think as time progresses and as more information is revealed, we're going to see more and more collaboration between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement. I mean, there was already local collaboration, and I think that was being emphasized if you were listening close enough to state leaderships, that they were complying with federal law, that they weren't preventing ICE agents from doing their jobs, even while their rhetoric saying, get the F out of our city or whatever it was, suggested that they were on the side of their own residents. We have to ask questions like, well, then why were you deploying the National Guard? Why were you deploying the State Patrol? Why were you deploying the DNR to these streets? And that's a separate point. And I think, we have to look at the federal response as well. I think there's been a lot of focus on it, but in my perspective, I think there's this overwhelming sense that there's a Minnesota nice. And when I first came here, actually, Native people said it was actually Minnesota ice. It's kind of ironic to think of it that way. It's not Minnesota nice. It's actually ice cold. And that's actually been my experience. I mean, just on a cultural level, culturally, white immigrants or white European immigrants here in Minnesota are, and generally seem to be more segregated. Like, this is a very segregated city, Minneapolis is, and people don't want to talk about it. And when you bring this up, people get really uncomfortable, but that's the reality. And so I think when ICE happened, it amplified those things, because now you have white anxiety on top of an already existing white supremacy. And then people were saying, oh, there's going to be a civil war. And it's like, between who? Like, who are the fighters in the civil war? Like, are the police and the National Guard going to take up arms against the federal government? Is it going to be blue MAGA versus red MAGA? It was just like kind of questioning this idea that the Democrats on one hand were some kind of like anti-fascist bulwark against Trump's authoritarianism, and I don't actually see that. I think it was a fight over white power, who had control over these people, right? And in some ways, if you listen to the rhetoric of Mayor Fry, of Governor Walz, the way I was listening to it was, these are our people to abuse. How dare you come in? Because we're coming out of George Floyd, right? We're coming out of line 3. We're coming out of recent histories of like child removal, right? People were talking about family separation as if the federal government was solely responsible for this. You have to remember that when the law firms Gibson Dunn were looking for cases to try and to overturn the federal law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was an effort to reverse or at least stop the removal of children from their families, Native children specifically, from their families. They were looking at Minnesota as test cases because Minnesota has the second highest rate of Indian child removal in the state. They far exceed South Dakota. In fact, the child welfare system in this state has greased its wheels with Indian children and throwing them in the foster care system, criminalizing their parents. This was something that's been well known for decades. That's why you had the formation of the American Indian movement in 1968. It wasn't just to stop police violence, it was also to stop Indian child removal. And with that, you also just had a recent report that came out that showed that Native women have the highest rates of mortality after giving birth, right? As high as, some of the developing countries around the world. And on top of that, you look at life expectancies of Native people in the state, they're far below the average. I think they're at the bottom again. So these are like third world conditions that Native people are living in. And I don't use that term lightly or to deride the third world by any means, but it's definitely related to the colonial relation and the occupation. That's not just a federal one, but is also implemented by the state. And so I always bring that up to kind of like, it was helpful to be teaching also during the federal occupation because we were all going through it. All of my students, myself, it impacted me personally. There were things that I had seen and heard, things with my own daughter at her daycare center. Daycare centers were being targeted. And just the absolute blasé attitude that police have. There was a school shooting here last year, and this idea that police are somehow there to protect children, it was just really on full display about the hypocrisy of like, what is the function of law enforcement when you have federal agents coming in and brutalizing children? Because this was happening, right? On top of vigilante violence that was going into Somali-run daycares, they're breaking into buildings or breaking into businesses. They were harassing families. This is still actually ongoing, by the way. But that was kind of my experience. I don't want to take up too much time because some of this we can get into in later questions, but I also haven't fully processed a lot of this stuff either. And when I hear somebody else's story, mine is one of many, but I think it's also important to remember that the absolute devastation that this has had on people, certain communities, like if you look at the people who were targeted, it was primarily Ecuadorians and Mexicans, right? And just absolute terrorization down the street from us. I was actually pulling my daughter on a sled one day and we witnessed a raid that was happening. And it was one of those moments where it's like, there's an extreme amount of danger, right? This is different from other front lines that I've been to, because it's actually like in residential neighborhoods. They're just specifically targeting civilians, right? And it's indiscriminate. They don't care. They're actually trying to get social media likes. They're trying to make snuff films of the violence that they're doing. Greg Bavino was here doing that as well. It was quite an experience. There's more to say. There's more to do. There's still stuff coming out about it. People have died. People have been deported. Families have been destroyed. Communities have been destroyed. The economy here, the local economy has been pretty wiped out. I mean, you came here and you walk around Dinkytown, those storefronts that are still closed, that's just from the pandemic, right? We haven't even fully felt the economic effects of Operation Metro Surge, and it's to say nothing of the emotional and physical trauma that it's inflicted on people in general.
That was a really powerful note to start on. I think you've opened up a lot of points that will continue to come up throughout this conversation. A couple of things you said that jumped out to me that I want to reflect on is one, I'm really glad you opened by talking about the pipeline and Line 3, because for me, a lot of the comrades who I have been doing organizing with since I moved back to Minneapolis last year and who I was involved in ICE resistance work with were people who during the fight to stop Line 3 were like involved in the pipeline resistance struggle and had experienced, had been brutalized by, as you said, these militarized DNR, quote unquote, conservation officers, which is crazy that they're conservation officers of the Department of Natural Resources, and they're being trained in riot police tactics. And they, my friends had been brutalized by these officers in 2021 during that struggle. And then now they were were being brutalized and tear gassed by them again at the site of Alex Preddy's murder right after it happened, right? And it just speaks to the idea that, I'm glad you pointed out also the exceptionalism that happens with Minnesota, and specifically with the state and local government of Minnesota, in which the narrative of the federal occupation then becomes a way to paint Jacob Fry and Tim Walz as these heroes of the anti-fascist resistance just because Jacob Fry dropped an F-bomb on TV. I can tell you very much that not a single person who was actually involved in resistance, in putting their safety on the line to go out and do patrols, to confront ICE agents, to try and stop abductions, not a single one of them, myself included, will have a single nice word to say about Jacob Fry or Tim Walz's role during Metro Surge. At no point were they anything but counterproductive to the actual resistance work that was happening, led by community members to try and keep their community safe. And then also part of that is this sort of whitewashing of the role played by state and local law enforcement. And these agencies that, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, during the Black Lives Matter uprisings after George Floyd's murder, were very clearly the bad guys in that situation. They were very clearly the ones who were terrorizing and brutalizing and carrying out horrific violence against people who were engaged in resistance. These same agencies were now kind of being held up in the most egregious cases as also part of the heroic fight against fascism, right? The narrative is that ICE is preventing our brave law enforcement officers from doing their jobs. But even for people who don't buy into that, they're still sort of painted as these hapless kind of bystanders who are just swept out of the way by these federal agents, when in fact they were actively aiding and abetting the brutality carried out by ICE agents. I was at the intersection where Renee Good was murdered less than an hour after her killing. And when we were being tear gassed and pepper sprayed, it was Border Patrol and it was ICE, but it was also MPD. It was also the Hennepin County Sheriff. And Jacob Fry himself showed up. I emerged out of a cloud of tear gas and I saw his smug face. And I was like, oh, you gotta be fucking kidding me right now. This is the last person I want to see. And everyone there felt that because, again, despite the way that the media, both nationally and internationally, painted him in particular as this charismatic hero, the brave mayor standing up to Trump, on the ground, people really, really resent the role that he played for taking up all of that attention while not doing nearly enough to actually keep the community safe. Many of my comrades are involved in tenant union organizing here, and there was a big, big push for an eviction moratorium because people are, sheltering in place. They can't go to work because they're afraid of getting picked up by ICE, meaning that they're not making any money, meaning that they're running up on rent being due on the first of the month, and they're facing eviction. Many of these are poor working class immigrants and people of color. And there was a demand for an eviction moratorium. And Jacob Fry kept kicking the can down the road. He refused to ever enact an eviction moratorium, as did Tim Walz. And you can say that, MPD, if they tried to arrest an ICE agent, it would inflame the situation. That's the argument that Jacob Fry gave when he was asked, why aren't your police arresting ICE agents who are committing crimes? And that was his argument. You know what? Fine. Even if you buy that, that doesn't explain why you as the mayor can't do what you did during the pandemic, during that other crisis and emergency, and enact an eviction moratorium. That is squarely within your power as the mayor. And the refusal to even do that was just so out of line with the sort of heroic narrative that the media was heaping on him and on Tim Walz too. And part of that's also because, when Tim Walz ran for vice president, he was portrayed as Coach Tim standing up to Trump. It's just part of this whitewashing narrative that you're right. It's blue MAGA versus red MAGA. And in your response to that last question, you were talking about specifically how that exceptionalism of Minnesota and of Minneapolis in particular has sort of been constructed around the idea of, as you put it, the immigrant neighbor. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is one of the more insidious kind of ways that the exceptionalism around Minnesota has been constructed during and after Metro Surge, of this idea of neighborliness as the political force driving the resistance against ICE. I want to quote really quickly from one article in The Atlantic that came out, I believe it was in January during Metro Surge, and it was getting a lot of play on social media. And this says, quote, if the Minnesota resistance has an overarching ideology, you could call it neighborism, a commitment to protecting the people around you no matter who they are or where they came from. And then it goes on to say, Minnesotans are insisting that their neighbors are their neighbors, whether they were born in Minneapolis or Mogadishu, end quote. And I think that that's a really good encapsulation of this sort of reduction of radical politics that underpinned ICE resistance to this sort of feel-good liberal multiculturalism that, not only papers over the deeply problematic and racist roots that run through a lot of the culture here in Minnesota and the history of the state that you named in your answer to that question, but also it really, I think, defangs the history of radical politics, activism, and organizing among oppressed communities, communities of color, working class communities that has always been a part of the state's history that has not been foregrounded in the construction of the exceptional Minnesota neighborism narrative. And so I guess that is a good segue into the next question I want to ask you, which is about some of this history. Over the last few months, a lot of people have been commenting on the fact that this is the second time, and of course, the first of these was the George Floyd uprisings in the summer of 2020, where you've seen Minneapolis be this global epicenter of both state repression and radical community resistance that has sort of captured the attention of not just the national population in the US, but really of the world as a whole. Back in January, I remember I saw one tweet that said that it might be the Chinese century, but this shit has definitively been the Minneapolis decade. And, that certainly on some level feels true, but also, again, that also runs the risk of exceptionalizing things in a certain way. And it's important, I think, to remember that not just the Twin Cities, but Minnesota as a whole has a very long history of grassroots organizing, radical political struggles. You had, revolutionary working class organizing in the 19th and 20th century, often led by socialist and communist immigrants. You had the formation of the American Indian movement here in Minneapolis back in the 60s. You had indigenous-led resistance against the Line 3 pipeline in the early 2020s. And I should note that a couple of years ago, you recorded a really great episode of the Red Nation podcast about some of this history around radical Black, Indigenous, and Chicano organizing in the Twin Cities. I'll link that in the show notes. I really encourage listeners to check that out if you want to dig into more of this history in detail. But I'm wondering if you could sort of reflect or summarize a bit for the listeners on how this history, both in terms of the more recent collective memory of 2020, but also this longer arc of radical organizing and resistance, how you see that having shaped the forms of community resistance and organization that we saw take root during Operation Metro Surge.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we have to kind of push the timeline a little bit further back and thinking about the Teamsters Rebellion that happened in the 1930s, but then also the sedition cases that were brought against leaders of the SWP, or the Socialist Workers Party. So back in the 1930s, there was a massive Teamsters strike. It was a general strike, and it led to police repression. Teamsters were killed. But in that history and how it's been narrated is also kind of a Minnesota or Minneapolis exceptionalism, and really focusing primarily on the Eastern European or the Nordic immigrants that had come in and formed the sort of base of the Teamsters rank and file, ignoring people like Ray Rainbolt, who was a Dakota person who was also one of the more militant leaders. And he was also brought up on sedition charges in the 1940s for his opposition of the United States into World War II, along with other SWP members. I want to do a whole podcast episode on that. I don't want to go into all the details, but the trial transcripts are pretty revealing in terms of not just the state's case against these SWP members, but their international connections to the Fourth International, which is a Trotskyist tendency, but also how labor organizers, but also communist revolutionaries were looking to the Twin Cities model, and they were actually in conversation with all these various people. So I think that's like really fascinating to me. And people knew who Ray Rainbolt was. They knew him as like a sort of militant leader. He was named in some of these cases as being somebody that Trotsky himself wanted to actually meet. So that actually came up in the trials, but that's a whole different story. But I bring it up because it shows you that it's a literal whitewashing of even that radical history. I actually want to know more about who Ray Rainbolt was and people like him who were the rank and file, but it also shows you that Indigenous people were part of the working class and engaged in these historic rebellions. The city of Minneapolis has actually been depopulated since World War II, which I think most people don't realize. It's never regained its population. And this is for a lot of reasons, deindustrialization, but also white flight to the suburbs, and the racialization of the inner core of the city. So this term that I heard a lot during the uprising was this notion of hyperlocalism, which I'm kind of like a little bit suspect of, because hyperlocal for who? First of all, Indigenous people have always been coming and going into this region. And hyperlocalism seems to be more about white people than it does to actually seem about like Black, Indigenous, and also Chicano, Mexican American, and immigrant people who call the city home and who have been impacted by its policies. And that interview that you brought up around the Soul Force, which was this exhibit, really highlights the um, lateral solidarity of these groups at a time during the impoverishment of what is known as the inner city of Minneapolis, and these areas that were once owner majority residential areas turning into renter majority residential areas. And these were primarily like on the north side, on what is presently called East Phillips neighborhood, that these places became where slumlords proliferated, right? And so after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s, the Black community had a major uprising across the country, right? And there was a lot of not just police discrimination, but everyday sort of discrimination against Black youth. And so out of that formed the Black Patrol and this organization that was called The Way. And that was actually the catalyst for both Latino or Latinx organizing as well as indigenous organizing in East Phillips. And they actually were in conversation with each other. And in fact, they even created common schools. There was the Way AIM Survival School for a while. It was a Black indigenous run survival school for Black and indigenous youth. And this became the catalyst, obviously, for the American Indian movement and forming the Indian patrols or the AIM patrols that surveilled police on East Franklin Avenue, where police would go and raid what were known as Indian bars at the time. And the population of East Franklin was very much native, but it was also a population that was part of the sort of underclass of the city that was working the service sector jobs, but then was also providing, in many ways, free labor for the city itself. And the cops were kind of in on the take and rounding up native men on the weekends and then putting them to work in community service projects for the city to beautify the city, mostly for the white residents, right? This is detailed in several memoirs of members of the American Indian movement. But nonetheless, this is the sort of catalyst of a certain kind of Red Power activism that was very much community focused. But I also kind of want to pull apart this idea of like hyper localism. While that was incredibly important for these organizations, they were always in conversation, not just with national political movements in the United States, but international political movements, going back to Ray Rainbolt to the present, where you have the formation of the International Indian Treaty Council and the inauguration of an international campaign for indigenous sovereignty the year after Wounded Knee in 1973, where there was an armed confrontation with federal forces. But then also the creation of these survival schools, which sent children to places like Cuba, sent them to the Eastern Bloc, sent them to third world countries to really get them an understanding of how the majority of the world was trying to throw off the shackles of colonialism and imperialism. And I know this because I've read some of the archives of these children, and the newsletters that they produced in these survival schools are really fascinating. There was one individual who was talking about how the mass genocide of indigenous people in the North American continent really gave a distorted view of the power of the global South, in the sense that indigenous people are part of the mass population, and they should be thinking of themselves as third world people who are in the majority, not in the minority in their own homelands. But also thinking about how our struggles connected with Vietnam, sending delegations to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and making those connections were incredibly important, right? And translating them into education for self-determination at a local level and what that means, or education for survival, and really combating here in these cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis, Indian child removal policies, where Native children would be forced into public school systems, but then being actively surveilled by teachers, social workers, who are then criminalizing their parents and then implementing child removal proceedings. And that's actually the foundation of the American Indian movement, was to stop Indian child removal. At the time, from a study found from the 1960s and 1970s, about 1/3 of all American Indian children under the age of 18 had been adopted out or put into a foster care system. So this was a widespread practice, but that's why AIM was founded, was to actually combat those things. As Madonna Thunderhawk has told me multiple times, the American Indian movement is a movement of families, first and foremost, meaning that they were building on the kinship ties that they had to create these political and social movements So that was very much the kind of glue, I guess, that holds the Native community in both St. Paul and Minneapolis and the surrounding suburbs together. And if you look at the sort of resistance that happened on the south side during the Operation Metro Surge, the sort of catalyst point was again Franklin Avenue, where you had Powwow Grounds, Cafe, as well as American Indian Center, two kind of community hubs for the Native community as being ground zero for operations, not just for the defense of the Native community, but actually defense of all the people who lived in that community. And that community itself is the most diverse place in Minnesota today, right? So I think knowing that kind of gives you an understanding that this is a continual place of ongoing sort of class and colonial conflict, not just with the federal government in terms of the Operation Metro Surge, but it's also where people like Derek Chauvin in the 3rd Precinct, the cops who murdered George Floyd in 2020, that was their base of operation. That was their stomping grounds. They called themselves the Cowboys of that particular area. And they used this kind of like racialized and frontier language to talk about policing Native children. You know, Native children were like 19 times more likely to be held at gunpoint by police officers from the 3rd Precinct than white men or white adults. And the kind of level of harassment and surveillance of Native youth and as well as Black youth doesn't really get talked about in these larger conversations, but that is very much the modus operandi of the Minneapolis Police Department, is sort of surveilling and also policing that particular community. So it exists today, right? So you have almost this double occupation that's ongoing. You have one of the Minneapolis Police Department with its historic sort of antagonisms with the community and the city, as well as the sort of federal occupation. And that's where George Floyd was murdered. That's where Alex Preddy was murdered. That's where, you know, Renee Good was murdered as well. So all those are sort of in that particular neighborhood.
Absolutely. And, you know, your last point you made there about the diversity of South Minneapolis, I think really gets at the heart of it, where what the sort of liberal narrative around Minneapolis's resistance during Metro Surge gets right is that there is something about the diversity of the city and the diversity of the communities who make up the population of the city that did, you know, lend itself to a more effective resistance against ICE. That's absolutely true. Where the liberal narrative gets wrong, and the liberal narrative, again, encapsulated in this idea of neighborism that was expressed in that Atlantic article that I quoted just now, is that it says that the way in which that diversity shaped the resistance was through this sort of amorphous liberal multiculturalism, and we all love each other and we all get along, and this is just a melting pot of all these different cultures here in Minneapolis. When in reality, the way that the diversity of the city, and particularly of the South Side, shaped the resistance to ICE is because that diversity meant that the city has been populated by communities who have been under occupation and have been under attack and have been under surveillance for decades and decades and decades, or in the case of indigenous people, for centuries, right? And that over the course of those decades and those centuries, communities have had to organize themselves to resist, to take care of themselves, to protect and defend themselves and each other. And that is why the diversity of Minneapolis led to a more effective and organized resistance, not just because we are all good neighbors to each other. And I think that the real danger of the neighborism narrative is that it turns the subject of resistance and radical activity in the Twin Cities into the sort of white middle class Minneapolis resident, rather than the people of color and the working class people who have actually been the ones resisting here. And I think that's exactly why you have to draw a direct line connecting the AIM patrols of the 60s and 70s that you were mentioning to the community patrols that were happening when ICE was here in the Twin Cities. And that there is this collective memory, this collective wisdom, these lessons learned through decades of iterative experimentation and processes of resistance, that all of that just gets completely swept under the rug when we start to exceptionalize Minnesota in the way that it has been in a lot of sort of liberal narratives, especially after the end of Metro Surge. I want to continue talking particularly about the way that the indigenous community here in the Twin Cities relates to everything that we saw over the winter. You know, during the peak of the surge, there was a very high profile, highly reported on incident where at least 4 indigenous members of the Oglala Lakota Nation were detained by ICE in Minneapolis. And that got a lot of attention and outrage in the press. And I think it really serves as a illustrative example and a very chilling reminder of the fact that when we're talking about the American immigration system and the violence of the border and its enforcement regime, we can't actually do that without also talking about the violent history of settler colonialism, genocide, and indigenous dispossession and displacement that was the basis of this country's founding, alongside, of course, the enslavement of Black people. And that's especially important as we are recording this on July 1st, just a few days out from the big America 250 so-called celebration, right? That it's especially important to emphasize that history. In the migrant justice movement, you often encounter the slogan that nobody is illegal on stolen land. And there's a similar sort of sentiment expressed often by indigenous people that we didn't cross the border crossed us. And I wanted to draw attention to remarks you made at the ICE Out of Minnesota rally that took place on the day of the January 23rd economic shutdown, where you said, quote, "This did not begin in December with Operation Metro Surge. I want you all to remember that when you're on the streets, when you're on your patrols, when you're watching your students, your family members get taken away, this isn't something new or unique, but this is a continuum of colonialism, and it takes all of us," end quote. My question for you is, why is it important to understand the current immigration crackdown and escalation of state violence, not just in Minneapolis, but really across the U.S. over the last year or two, within a larger historical context of settler colonialism and indigenous displacement?
In 1787, when the United States drafted its first constitution, where we're at right now, a place called Badote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, was the westernmost boundary of that claimed land. And one of the first things that the United States did, obviously the people who lived here, Dakota people, didn't have a full understanding of who the United States was, nor did they really recognize its sort of sovereignty or power. But one of the first things that happened was the United States wanted to build a military fort here. And that was the creation of what later became known as Fort Snelling, but it was a military fort that was created at that confluence at Badote, which is a site of creation for Dakota people. It's a very sacred site. And they created that to project military power in this region, right? Not just here locally in what is now the Twin Cities, but throughout Minnesota, Makoche, but also looking westward beyond the Mississippi, right? So that once, obviously the Louisiana Purchase happened after and kind of opened up that western area. But nonetheless, this became the sort of ground zero for the military occupation as it began. And the military fort essentially served several purposes. One was just to project power in the region, the threat of military force of anyone or anything that stood in the way of the United States. That came to a bloody head in 1862 when the U.S. Dakota War ensued. There was a Dakota uprising that killed hundreds of settlers. And essentially, this was the result of decades of broken treaties and the forcing of people onto increasingly smaller and smaller land base. But then also the formation of the treaty itself that actually secured Fort Snelling was never ratified by the Senate. So according to U.S. law and the Constitution, all treaties, whether they're with indigenous nations or other nations, have to be ratified by the Senate. So that is considered by Dakota people at the time an illegal occupation. And today, since those have never been ratified, it could be also considered an illegal occupation as well. And it is stolen Dakota land because even according to the U.S.'s own laws, it has never been ratified by the Senate. And even several military tribunals have examined it and said, we don't really actually know the legal basis of this fort to exist. But during the war itself, they used it as a concentration camp for Dakota people. Men, women, and children were kept there. Many hundreds died. Some of those burials actually happened in and around the fort itself. Many of them are undisclosed. But as we saw recently, some of these mass graves were turned into off-leash dog parks that resulted in this really racist backlash from white residents who co-opted Native political slogans such as "water is life" and "dogs deserve water too," but then also "dog lives matter." There was other ones I can't even remember.
The one that was "no dog is illegal," I think.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, and this is on undisclosed mass burial sites for Dakota people. But this is the mentality that exists. set aside the military occupation. I think we often think of these as like federal impositions, but actually there's a common sense sort of understanding and enforcement of those rules and the seizure of land and the taking of land and also the genocide that ensues to remove people from that land. And I think what better encapsulates sort of white supremacy than the privileging of an animal over the lives and the dignity of Dakota people, right? Not even an animal. I shouldn't even say that. It's actually these animal owners, right? So that area becomes a federal reservation. It actually includes what is presently the University of Minnesota campus, right? So the University of Minnesota campus kind of capitalizes on this military reservation that was created by this fort, and also receives stolen land from indigenous people. And so the plunder of that land is incredibly important. It becomes the sort of founding capital of the state of Minnesota because they sell that land to private owners and use that as a sort of way to not only get the state out of debt, but also to build education institutions like the University of Minnesota and establish what are called permanent university funds that begin to loan out through bonds the creation of roads and bridges and the infrastructure for capital, essentially. But the site itself then kind of becomes open for federal buildings. You have the creation of the Whipple building, which is in the original military reservation boundaries. And that Whipple building becomes the Department of Homeland Security headquarters for the region. And as that sort of ensues, like that becomes sort of ground zero for this occupation. So in many ways, while the fort itself, the historic fort, fell into disrepair, was later rebuilt as a replica, the actual site itself is still used by federal forces to impose the will of the federal government on not just indigenous people this time, but also anyone that they see as a threat. And that includes this kind of supposed immigration enforcement operation that they're running under the guise of Operation Metro Surge to people who actually stand in the way of that, right? So it actually reveals that this is the intended sort of outcome of the fort itself lives on through this current iteration of the Whipple building and the headquartering of ICE and DHS in this area, because now it's still, like Fort Snelling did in the past, projecting federal power to the region.
I'm glad you brought up the Whipple building, and I encourage listeners to go on to Google Maps and look up the Whipple building and then look up historic Fort Snelling. They are like quite literally effectively on top of each other. This is the same site where, Fort Snelling, the actual 19th century fort itself, is still standing. It's operated by the state parks as a historic site. And it is right next to where the Whipple building is now. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Whipple building really is essentially the new manifestation of that, and the new manifestation of all of the violence and the bloodshed and the horrors that came with Fort Snelling. And, we often use the language of concentration camps to describe ICE detention centers like the Whipple building, where people are brought from all over the region to be detained often under really horrific conditions. There have been some horror stories coming out of Whipple, as there have been from other ICE detention centers. And as you said, Fort Snelling itself was the site of a concentration camp more than 100 years ago during the U.S. Dakota War. And this has been a site that has been used as a concentration camp for whoever the U.S. empire is seeing as its enemies, who it needs to target at various points throughout history. And that is, again, historical continuity that I think really cannot be overstated. I think this is maybe a good opportunity, while we're talking about settler colonialism, to shift our focus to take a more global perspective and tie not just the immigration enforcement and the violence of the border regime to the history of settler colonialism on the North American continent, but then also to tie that to the larger global escalation of U.S. imperialism that we've been seeing. I really wanted to bring you on to talk about this in a global perspective, because I think it's no coincidence that 2026 began with the Twin Cities in the depths of this fascist occupation that we've been talking about so far, but it also began simultaneously with a dramatic escalation of the U.S. empire's aggression abroad, and I'm specifically referring to here on January 3rd, when the U.S. military invaded Venezuela, kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro, and this was, a brazen attempt to reassert imperial hegemony over the Western Hemisphere as part of the sort of what's called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And I remember I saw the news about the kidnapping of Maduro, which ironically enough happened on a day when I was spending the whole day at the Whipple building monitoring the comings and goings of ICE agents. And I woke up that morning ready to get in the car and go to Whipple, and I saw the news notification that the U.S. had kidnapped Maduro. And I was really struggling to wrap my head around the fact that at the exact same time, you have U.S. military forces kidnapping a foreign head of state out of his home in the middle of the night. And simultaneously with that, you have federal agents, many of whom are so militarized and are decked out in so much tactical gear, they look undistinguishable from special operations military forces, doing the exact same thing to my neighbors and my community members right here on quote unquote American soil, just miles from where I am. And these things are happening at the same time. There was, in particular, one case that really made the rounds in the news and on social media of a man, I believe his name was Chung Lee Tao, who was pulled out of his home in the early hours of the morning in his underwear and a bathrobe. And just that photo bears so many striking similarities to the photos that you saw of Maduro in his Nike tracksuit, handcuffed on the plane, surrounded by these agents. And so I'm wondering, to sort of introduce this more global perspective into the conversation, if you have reflections on what this says about the current state of imperial decay and social crisis in the United States in terms of these simultaneous federal occupation of Minneapolis, that it happened at the same time as this rapid intensification of imperialist aggression abroad. And, we haven't even gotten to the war in Iran yet, which we'll get to in a later question. But to speak in broad terms to this, how can understanding these developments in tandem with one another help us understand them as a whole and individually?
Yeah, I think maybe it was like several weeks after the illegal kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the elected president of Venezuela and first combatant Celia Flores. There was a ICE operation in the north side of Minneapolis that resulted in the shooting of, I believe his name was like Julio Sosa Siles. And there was obviously a community response to that became sort of iconic in like the north side. And there was a FBI vehicle that had been seized, and documents had kind of revealed this operation that was like giving badges to ICE agents and federal agents who were participating in this operation. I can't remember what they're called, like Achievement Unlocked. What is that? Like, it's a gaming reference, I guess. So
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and it was like skull and crossbones kinds of stuff. It was pretty sick, right? But if you think about how that relates, it's like on one hand you have the attack on a sovereign nation, then on the other you have the attack on people who were ostensibly fleeing the kind of sanctions regime that was imposed on that sovereign nation to essentially choke out Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution, killing upwards to 40,000 people as a result of these sanctions. So in many ways, like pursuing them as they even come into the United States under ostensibly like refugee status or seeking refuge within the United States, they're not safe, right? And even the narrative that these individuals had attacked ICE agents with a broom or a shovel had fallen apart. Evidence later emerged that this was just a straight up assault on these individuals just for the way that they looked and the way that they had talked, right? And if you think about that in connection to Venezuela, this war that the United States has been waging against Venezuela has been going on since the Bolivarian Revolution began in earnest with the election of Hugo Chavez and the inauguration of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, and their kind of ascendancy to power and the popular power of this revolutionary project, providing a kind of platform for regional integration, as well as providing material support or economic support for the Cuban Revolution in the form of oil. But then on top of that, also the internationalism that the revolutionary government had exhibited and practiced with, people like indigenous people in the Northern Plains who were receiving heating assistance from Citgo, which was at the time run by the Venezuelan government, in places where heating oil is like jacked up during the winter time. So this was a very internationalist project. And the goal, not just of the Trump administration, this goes back to Obama, who really implemented these sanctions on Venezuela. In many ways, Trump is just like carrying forward that particular project and in creating the kind of idea of like narco-terrorism, which has been implemented in attempting to destabilize the region, whether it's in Mexico or Central America, and then Venezuela. And at the very beginning, you can look at Marco Rubio's announcement of this narco terrorist threat as actually threatening U.S. oil interests and offshore drilling, but then also in a region that borders Venezuela. So, like, right off the bat, you have this kind of admission that this is not just about preventing whatever drugs coming into the United States, because most drug trafficking, when it does happen by land, doesn't go through the Caribbean. It actually happens through the Pacific, but that's a different story. But then there's a creation of this sort of this narco terrorist idea that then becomes the impetus for capturing Maduro, and he's sort of the kingpin of this drug operation. When it comes out later that the feds can't even really honestly, with a straight face, say that that's the reason why. So now they're trying to figure out other charges to bring him and his wife. And of course, this sort of mission creep is very common, especially in the war on terror, when you have an undefined sort of ambiguous kind of entity. And I think that really relates to something that I've been talking about quite frequently. The idea of the Indian Wars is this war on terror is actually a continuation of the Indian Wars, not by me just saying that and saying, oh, there's like parallels between the Indian Wars of the past and the Indian Wars of today, but or the wars on terror of today, but actually the Office of Legal Counsel during the Trump administration actually made that point when they bombed Syria for its alleged chemical weapons facilities. They made the justification that the president of the United States has the authority to make war without congressional approval. Why? Because in 1790, when the ink was barely dry on the U.S. Constitution, George Washington made war with the Northwest Indian Confederacy. And that began a series of more than a century of undeclared wars against indigenous nations, right? So think about what I just said previously about this unratified treaty that set aside land that was illegally taken for this military base. So the Senate or the United States engaged in treaty making, recognizing the sovereignty of these nations, these indigenous nations, right, that had to go through this formal process of being ratified under constitutional provisions, but never did Congress ever declare war on an indigenous nation, right? So if we think about, I guess one of the cases I always bring up is you think about the Black Hills and the seizure of the Black Hills. Congress actually declared that seizure illegal, but never declared the war that was made on indigenous nations to seize the Black Hills illegal, right? Because if they had, then they would have to also begin to draw a legal scrutiny towards operations in Iran, this illegal kidnapping operation of a foreign head of state, right? And the centuries of warfare against not just indigenous nations, but any nation that kind of falls outside the bounds of what the United States considers its sort of civilizational hegemony, right? Any nation it declares as a savage kind of threat to Western civilization can then become a sort of target of these undeclared wars. And the precedent is going back to George Washington. So that's kind of a long answer, but it also shows you that there's a through line and that these people are actually thinking of this. Their logic is like, oh, this is just an extension of the Indian Wars of the 19th century. It's not Nick Estes, the historian, saying it. It's the sort of smartest people in the room, so to speak, who are saying this, that this is the legal precedent for the forever wars of today.
I think that's a great framing for the direction that this conversation is going in. And I think that it's also worth emphasizing that it really, I think, at least in my view, is not a coincidence that you have the intensification of state repression happening alongside the escalation of imperialist violence abroad. And particularly, this is happening within the context of the new national security strategy that was put out last year, the reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, the Don Roe Doctrine, as they're calling it, which I did an episode earlier this year with Guillaume Long about, that I'll link in the show notes for folks, that like really the sort of MO of, I think, the US empire in this moment of declining global hegemony, the rise of China and the global South, is to really try and shift towards a more assertive posture of controlling the Western hemisphere and asserting control over what the US empire sees as its quote unquote backyard. And part of that includes the domestic territory of the United States itself. If you're going to be asserting greater control over Mexico, over Venezuela, over Colombia, as we saw with these elections, Honduras, the rest of sort of Latin Latin America and the Americas more generally, that also includes asserting more aggressive and violent control over your own population here in the United States itself. And that's why we saw the brutality with which ICE and CBP and these other federal agencies conducted themselves during Operation Metro Surge. It's why that they put the city under military occupation. It's because if you're asserting control over what you see as your backyard, you have to actually go all the way in asserting that control. And I guess that's a great segue into the next question I want to ask you, which is about this concept of the imperial boomerang, which is a framework that, we often use to describe the interconnection between imperialist violence abroad and fascism or state repression at home. It's a concept that, of course, is taken from Aimé Césaire, the Martinican anti-colonial theorist, his book Discourse on Colonialism. I've done an episode on the imperial boomerang. I think it's a really powerful and evocative metaphor that is useful on a rhetorical level, at least, for highlighting these connections and for sort of breaking down a false distinction that liberalism constructs between the so-called foreign and the domestic. And it seems to me especially apropos for discussing the role of immigration enforcement as an avenue of fascism in the US, given that, as you alluded to earlier in your discussion of the shooting of the Venezuelan man in North Minneapolis, immigration itself is in large part a boomerang effect caused by the destabilization and plunder of the global South by imperialist states. At the same time, I've also seen this thesis of the imperial boomerang critiqued by some scholars and activists for failing to fully sort of encompass the long history of colonial violence against Black and Indigenous people here in the US, as if it sort of posits colonialism as something that happens over there and then comes back home, rather than something that was happening here to begin with as well. And I know that you've talked about this with Charisse Burden-Stelly, this idea that the imperial slingshot might be a more accurate metaphor rather than the imperial boomerang to describe these specific patterns of violence that we're seeing when we talk about state repression in the US, especially in the context of Metro Surge. Could you say more about what you see as being both the analytical value and limitations of the imperial boomerang concept in an American context, specifically with regards to the events of these last few months that we've been talking about in Minneapolis and globally? And if you want to, make a pitch for the slingshot as an alternative way to think about it, please do.
I'm gonna read you something that just came out a couple days ago, and this is, we're recording July 1st, so this might be a little bit old news by the time this gets published, but this is a city councilwoman in New York City. She's a Republican. Her name is Vicky Palladino, and she's responding to the sort of DSA candidates winning these elections on the Democratic ticket in New York City, or I guess in New York, not just New York City. But she writes in response to this election, and it's a quote tweet of this right-wing propagandist who is highlighting the people who are on the DSA National Political Committee. And she writes, "There was a time in our history not too long ago when the CIA/FBI would have made sure unabashed revolutionaries like this, in this case DSA, were neutralized one way or another. In fact, that was basically the entire point of having them." I mean, controversy sometimes brings clarity, like whether these are revolutionaries, let's put that aside for a second, but actually see what she's actually saying. That she's saying that in many ways, whether you had a domestic intelligence agency like the FBI or a foreign intelligence agency like the CIA, they were created to neutralize communist threats to the United States, or in this case, she calls unabashed revolutionaries, right? It's the goal, it's the purpose of the United States to contain and neutralize, right, any threats to the capitalist order. So whether it's a slingshot or a boomerang kind of assumes that it left and then it kind of comes back. And it's like, my point would be it never really left. It's just still here. I don't even know if slingshot is an appropriate metaphor for that. But I do agree with Charisse's analysis of that, the underlying analysis. Maybe the metaphor needs to be expanded to some other kind of thing. I don't know. But the point that she was trying to make is that just because the United States felt that it had shored up its continental empire doesn't mean that repression just stopped. It just shifted, right, to the creation of things like the FBI. It's no coincidence that that happens shortly after the closing of the frontier. And of course, most people don't think about this, but there were things like the Green Corn Rebellion, which was indigenous and white tenant farmers and black tenant farmers in Oklahoma, often organized under the Industrial Workers of the World, who led a rebellion against the draft during the lead up to World War One, right? And people like J. Edgar Hoover kind of cut their teeth on repressing these social movements, right? And it doesn't get talked about as sort of an anti-colonial movement, but the transformation of the Red Scare of the indigenous people who were on the Western frontier then becomes an internal enemy, right? So you just have the transformation of that enemy. And according to the Honorable Vicky Palladino, that threat needs to be neutralized, right? So I think thinking about and sort of expanding how we understand these domestic intelligence apparatuses and how we understand imperialism is that it is always dialectical between the so-called domestic and the foreign, right? They're operating in ways, and we see like even in the 70s and the 80s, the CIA being exposed as operating domestically and policing anti-war and left-wing organizations. And the FBI has served a political function. And this is the other kind of admission here, is that the FBI is a political police force, right? I actually appreciate her honesty, that to say that the FBI isn't out there to protect us. It's not to protect us from fraud. It's not there to protect us from violence, right? If you go on an Indian reservation, that's actually the FBI's jurisdiction. We have a structural issue of genocide, right? Of murdered, missing Indigenous women under the purview of the FBI, right? But what has the FBI facilitated, like on a place like, Pine Ridge, is a reign of terror, of mass surveillance and counterinsurgency operations, right? And if we think about what the FBI was doing here during Operation Metro Surge, in tandem working with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, as well as DHS, was 100% counterinsurgency. But counterinsurgency kind of assumes that there's an insurgency, but there was never an armed insurgency here. So it had to create one, right? It had to create this narrative. And if we think about it today, like we're both heading to this hearing of 15 people who were indicted, it's actually trying to rewrite history and say, political speech is now considered insurgent speech, right? Even the possession of materials such as left-wing zines can land somebody decades in prison, as we saw with the Prairie Land case. We're living in a moment, I'm not going to say it was like it's the worst moment in history. I don't want to exceptionalize this particular moment, but we are returning to a moment, like a cyclical cycle of repression that is invoking this genocidal history of anti-communism, because if you think about the CIA and things like Operation Phoenix that happened in Vietnam, it was an assassination campaign of neutralizing, as the Honorable Vicky Palladino says, neutralizing the Viet Cong. And what did that result in? It resulted in the deaths of millions of people, right? So I think of counterinsurgency as narrative campaigns, first and foremost. It's to how do we rewrite the police function of Operation Metro Surge, because now it's no longer about immigration enforcement. It's actually now about combating the sort of anti-ICE protesters that were out there on the streets. That's the focus of the administration, right? All of a sudden, they got rid of Kristi Noem and Markwayne Mullin is her replacement, but we don't hear the same sort of scrutiny. We don't hear the same sort of criticism at a national level of what Markwayne Mullin is doing, when in fact he's leading a different kind of counterinsurgency, which is a narrative campaign to frame anyone who, just exercises what are, I hate to use this liberal framework, what are constitutional rights of free speech, is now a threat, like is now considered a domestic threat, whether it's under the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which talks about Antifa, right? Being an anti-fascist is now illegal in the United States and can get one charged under counterterrorism laws, right?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the Minnesota 15 who have been indicted on trumped up federal charges for alleged participation in anti-ICE protests. And I watched the press conference where the U.S. attorney unveiled these charges, and he explicitly said the investigation of these 15 people and of the resistance more generally, because he also said there's going to be more indictments coming, that all of this is happening under the auspices of what you just cited, the NSPM 7, the presidential memo on national security that Trump signed last year, which designates Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And that really uses the framework of counterterrorism and the war on terror, which has, of course, been probably the defining feature of American imperialism abroad for decades, using that as now the primary vehicle for state repression here in the United States. And the point of, collapsing the domestic foreign distinction isn't to say that everything operates exactly the same in the US versus abroad, because there are very important distinctions in how these dynamics operate domestically versus internationally, but rather to say that we can understand them as co-constitutive of each other. The way the US empire engages in violence abroad shapes the way it does so here, quote unquote, at home, and vice versa. I think it's also worth noting that, the flip side to all of this, whether we want to talk about the boomerang, the slingshot, whatever your preferred projectile weapon metaphor, of choice is, the flip side to that is that if we take seriously the implications of understanding the connections between the domestic and the international when we're talking about state repression and violence, it also means that it opens up avenues for us to learn from ways that people elsewhere in the world, in the global south, anti-colonial struggles, national liberation struggles, have engaged in resistance against violence and occupation. And what I mean very specifically is that during Metro Surge, I gave a teach-in on this to some activists and organizers, sort of highlighting how, I think without even realizing it, a lot of the types of patrols and community rapid response networks and so on that were opening up, that had emerged during Metro Surge and that were responding to these ICE raids and these abductions, they were following, again, without realizing it, a lot of the basic logics of the primary form of resistance that takes place against colonialism in the global south, which is the logic of, guerrilla resistance, and the idea of when you are up against a much better equipped, much better funded, much deadlier adversary, you have to adopt certain, types of tactics that are much more aimed around depleting their morale, around using the environment against them, all of these sorts of things. And that's exactly what you saw with the resistance here in Minneapolis. Obviously, it's not an armed insurgency like you see in most global south guerrilla movements. But what you did see was, Ken Klippenstein was reporting on these leaked emails and whistleblowers from Border Patrol and ICE saying that morale in these agencies was at an all-time low, that Border Patrol couldn't find agents from other postings around the country who were willing to take the Minneapolis assignment, because why would they come here? You come here, you can't get a good night's sleep in your hotel because there's protesters outside keeping you awake all night. Then you go out, you're trying to do your job all day, and you're getting followed around by community members who hate you and want you gone. You're getting whistles blown at you. People, are yelling at you, screaming at you. It completely undermines the morale and therefore the effectiveness of what they were trying to do. And this is something that these agencies themselves acknowledge as one of the biggest obstacles to them trying to reach their quotas of abductions and disappearances and detentions. Similarly, it's like you had ICE agents who were, the videos of them falling on the ice on the ground. This is the dead of winter in Minneapolis. Part of the logic of guerrilla warfare is always involved leverage the fact that your terrain, your environment better than the enemy does. And this was something that I really observed because, kind of by coincidence, one of my final papers for one of my classes last semester, I was writing about Marxist theories of guerrilla warfare. So I'd been reading a lot of Mao on guerrilla warfare, Che Guevara, Abraham Guillen, these other sort of seminal texts about the theory and the logic of guerrilla strategy. And then I was seeing a lot of this sort of replicate in these ways, again, kind of organically, without any intentionality or awareness on the part of a lot of people. I saw those sort of logics replicating themselves in the forms of grassroots resistance that we saw during Metro Surge. And I think that, to me, at least, it speaks to the way that the connection between the domestic and the foreign is useful, not just for understanding how repression operates, but also understanding how resistance operates. And so I think it's something that is worth teasing out here. Before we close out, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You were talking about Indian wars and how there's been this connection between American imperial violence abroad and the history of Indian wars as providing legal justification for that. Last October, you published an article in the journal Middle East Critique titled U.S. Imperialism is an Indian War. And you opened that piece, which I will link in the show notes. You open it by reflecting it on the June 2025 U.S. bombing of Iranian nuclear sites in what was called Operation Midnight Hammer. And you situate that within a sort of larger historical context of what's often called forever wars in West Asia or in the Middle East. You write, quote, Indian wars were the original forever wars. They set the precedent for preemptive, unilateral, and so-called defensive wars against peoples and nations that the U.S. deemed outside the bounds of civilization. Today's undeclared wars, whether fought under the banner of the global war on terror, or more recently, the so-called 12-day war on Iran, do not merely resemble the Indian wars, they inherit them, end quote. You already, I think, did a really great job of sort of summarizing the basic logic of what you're arguing there. But I'm wondering, you wrote this piece in the aftermath of Operation Midnight Hammer last summer. You published it last October, but I actually only read it for the first time earlier this year, a few weeks after the end of Operation Metro Surge and just after the beginning of the U.S. Zionist joint war on Iran that's been ongoing since the end of February. So I was wondering, to sort of close this conversation and bring this connection between the domestic and the international full circle, I wanted to invite you to reflect on the arguments you made in that piece now that the US has been doubling down even more aggressively on that escalation from last summer that prompted the article in the first place. How can the argument that you were making in this article help us to make sense of the current war on Iran, as well as the broader intensification of aggression from the decaying American empire? And again, tying it back to the expansion of state repression domestically, like what we saw with the occupation of Minneapolis. What does it mean for our understanding of the imperial boomerang?
I think one way to think about it is temporal. There's a tendency to sort of really exceptionalize the moment. Like, I wanted to look at Operation Midnight Hammer in the context of a longer history, because that's actually the way that imperialism views itself. It thinks about it as more of a continuation. So how do we think about resistance to that as a continuation, not just within the moment itself, but within a long-term history, not just a history of the past, but a history of the future as well. And so, yeah, that's kind of like what I guess my takeaway from that moment is, because of the undeclared nature of these wars and the intervention that ensues, there really isn't a mechanism by which we can stop these wars unless there is some kind of intervention, unless there's a rewriting of the constitutional principles, right, that have been used. And so we're kind of trapped in this moment of forever wars that perpetuate not just foreign military intervention, but bring those sort of lessons home to the United States itself in the repression of these domestic movements and what springs up. And so I'd really encourage people to be more forward thinking and long-term thinking, because election cycles tend to suck out the oxygen in the room. And we often get people who seem really radical in the lead up to an election, but then tend to reinforce the status quo once in power. And so we actually need independent policy platforms and strategies for social change that don't continue the path that we're on. And I think there's glimmers of hope in terms of, I think it was like 1/3 of Gen Z has a positive view of like communism and socialism, or actually I think it's 66% has a positive view. So we do see, like, even in the Daniel Rosen indictment of these 15, he was the U.S. attorney that indicted these 15 anti-ICE protesters. He called political violence a national scourge, right? Not homelessness, not lack of healthcare, not, inadequate housing, dirty water, lack of a future, environmental collapse. None of those things are a national scourge. This is the priority. This is the solution that's on offer, right? And I think it's a very cynical one. And we have to call it out for what it is, but then also offer long-term sort of solutions. But that's kind of a short answer, but I think that's kind of summarizes my views on it.
Well, I think that's a really powerful note to end on. I want to thank you so much, Nick, for taking the time for this conversation. This is probably one of the most personally meaningful episodes that I've recorded of this podcast, just because everything we've been talking about here was so personal to me, and I know to you as well. And I'm really grateful for your analysis and insight on all of this. For the listeners, I will leave you today with a quote from the Black revolutionary political prisoner and martyr, Brother George Jackson, from his posthumously published book, Blood in My Eye, which he finished writing just days before being murdered by guards at San Quentin State Prison in California. And this is really one of the most, I think, life-changing books I've ever read. I think it's a must-read for anyone who is committed to radical and revolutionary politics. And I want to share this quote in particular because it's one that during the occupation, during Metro Surge, I kept returning to it. And so did my comrades, to give ourselves strength and keep ourselves grounded, especially after the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And in Blood in My Eyes, George Jackson writes, quote, "Settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, the generations more will die or live poor butchered half-lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done, discover your humanity and your love in revolution. Pass on the torch, join us, give up your life for the people." Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.